There's been a lot of interest with Poison Blade Vortex on Assassin this league, and I played this skill a lot in the past. I haven't done it on Assassin, and I haven't done a crit-based version, which is kind of what the Assassin is asking for. So I threw together a pop, and I also tested a little bit in game on like a pseudo version, and it's looking way better than expected, and it performed much better than expected. Even on a version of the build where I was dealing 30%, maybe at best 50% of the actual this build's damage, I was able to take down Maven. I could do tier 16.5s. I could do at least tier 16s with 6 mods. So it really surprised me. But that being said, there are a couple of problems that this build faces that we will speak about. I do think it is going to be an excellent league starter. I'm not 100% sure I'm going to start it myself. I'm kind of tempted to do Arrow's Ice Shot Penetration build, but before we get into Blade Vortex and the Assassin, what we first need to speak about is Poison, because this is quite a misunderstood mechanic in PoE. So with poisons can be applied by skills that deal physical or chaos damage, unless you have the Assassin Ascendancy All Damage Can Poison, which we're not using because Blade Vortex is a physical skill, so it inherently can deal damage poison. In order to deal poison, you need to have chance to deal poison, which we have, 100% chance to poison, and then there is the scaling aspect of poison. So this is a very budget level 95 version of this build, and you're probably looking at it thinking, wow, 6.5 million DPS on a budget build, that's so good. The thing with poison is that there are different components of it. The thing that most people get trapped by is this: total DPS, including poison, or total damage per poison. With poisons, every time you hit an enemy, assuming you have a 100% chance to inflict poison, every time you hit an enemy, and with Blade Vortex that's 8.3 times a second, it'll inflict 1 poison. That poison will deal a certain amount of damage, and it'll last for a certain duration. Damage over time. If you increase the number of seconds, you're increasing the total damage. So if you deal 100 poison damage over 5 seconds, that 1 poison will deal 500 damage. If you're dealing that 100 damage over 1,000 seconds, it's going to look like, wow, you're dealing like millions and millions of damage, but it's being dealt over an unrealistic period of time. So with poisons, what you want is fast application. So you're able to apply multiple poisons very quickly. You also then want to have a high damage per second, and then you also want to have a reasonable duration. So in this version of the build, we have a decent poison damage per second, and it has a duration of 5 seconds. And with our hit rate of 8 seconds, we're able to apply 40 poisons to an enemy. On the bossing version, we're throwing in temp chains, which makes our poisons last longer, meaning that our total poison damage is higher. The reason I'm pointing this out is because for mapping, having a high total poison damage, let's say your poisons last for 10 seconds, but they're not dealing a high damage per second, it's going to feel horrible. For bossing, having a higher poison duration with a decent DPS is actually more viable, because you're able to hit the boss a bunch, apply a bunch of stacks, and then you're able to run around and dodge their skills while still dealing damage to that enemy. But for mapping, the biggest mistake a lot of people make is they don't look at their poison damage per second. They're hyper-focused on their total poison damage. The main culprit with this is Unbound Ailments, which gives you 64% increased duration of ailments inflicted with supported skills. So this is going to make your total poison damage look way better. However, it's not going to increase your damage per second as much. So what we need to find is a balance between those two things. But now let's speak about the new Assassin Ascendancy and why I am choosing this. So firstly, what I want to go for is Toxic Delivery. Poison you inflict with critical strikes deals 20% more damage. On this version of the build, we are going to be using Perfect Agony, and this has some great upsides. It also has a major downside that I will speak about. Damage over time multiplier for ailments is equal to critical strike multiplier. So instead of scaling damage over time multiplier, we're scaling our critical strike multiplier. Anything you find on gear or the tree that says increased damage over time multiplier will not actually work. Stuff like increased damage over time, though, will work. So increased damage over time multiplier, don't take that. That's why you might be saying, like, why are we not taking growth and decay? it doesn't actually work when you're using Perfect Agony. The next line, critical strikes do not deal extra damage, doesn't matter, but very importantly, non-critical strikes cannot inflict ailments. And this is very, very important for something we need to speak about in a second. But let's go back to this Ascendancy. So because we're always critting, we need to always be critting because we're not critting, we're not applying poisons. We are dealing 20% more damage. We're also getting 5% increased poison duration for each poison you inflicted recently, up to a maximum of 100. We can inflict 20 poisons in like 2.5 seconds, assuming you're hitting a boss consistently. So this is going to increase our total poison damage. And then for recovery, recover 0.5% of life per poison affecting enemies you kill. Very nice recovery for mapping, not so much for bossing. We do have solutions for bossing recovery that I will get into. The next thing I want to grab is Unstable Infusion, chance to gain a power charge on crit or non-crit, and maximum power charges. Power charges are going to increase our critical strike chance. Again, very important for this. And then Mystical Infusion, this is really, really good for getting our base crit up. Base spell critical strike chance of spells is equal to that of main hand weapon. So with Blade Vortex, this has a 6% base critical strike chance. And then any increases to our critical strike chance are going to multiply that base number. So if we're able to increase that base number, let's say you have 100% increased critical strike chance and your base crit is 6, I mean you have like a 12% critical strike chance. However, if we can get that to like 10%, then you would instead have like a 20% chance to crit. So base crit, very, very strong. And there's been some buffs to base crit on certain items, some nerfs on certain ones in terms of base crit, but early on we can get something like this, an Edisomite dagger with 10% base crit. So that'll mean that our BV is getting an additional 4% base crit, which is very, very strong, and it's how we're able to get our crit, even at like level 70, get our crit up to 95%, and that's without any flaws and no shenanigans on the config. As for the other Ascendancy point, we're not actually going to be going with another assassin point. I want to go with this Oshabi thing over here. Let me first explain. So with Blade Vortex, when you cast this spell, it'll add a blade to like a spinning aura around you that hits every X number of seconds. If you cast it again, it'll add another blade. If you cast it again, add another blade, up to a maximum of 10. So with Blade Vortex, you don't want to be sitting there going click, 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 click up until you have 10. So we use something called Unleash. So over time, Unleash like stores charges. It stores these seals. And then when you cast that spell, its effects will reoccur. So with normal Unleash and Blade Vortex, after less than, it's like 2 seconds, what will happen is instead of just getting one blade on your Blade Vortex, it'll reoccur and you'll get 4 or 5 blades very, very quickly. However, with this Oshabi Ascendancy, we have the Primal Owl. Unsealed spells gain 5% more damage each time their effects reoccur. Skills supported by Unleash have +3 maximum number of seals. So with this and Unleash support, we're getting 6 seals. And then on the tree, we're getting a 7th seal. So once you have this Ascendancy, you'll have 7 seals, which means we're getting 35% more damage. If it is reoccurring 7 times, it might actually be 40% more damage. I'm not 100% sure, but this will mean that when you push your Blade Vortex, you're getting 8 blades almost instantly and a huge amount of more damage. This is the stuff that was missing on like the little test that I did. The other thing that was missing on the test that I did and why I was losing so much damage was that I was missing this 20% more damage. I was missing this 35% more damage. Also, I was missing Mystical Infusions. So in the footage, I was sitting at like 60% crit chance, meaning that I was only applying poison 60% of the time. So it was literally like 30% of the damage that we should be having on this version of the build. So if it wasn't for this, I'm not entirely sure I would be convinced that BV was good, but with this, I think it's going to feel really, really nice. We can actually get an additional 2 Unleashes. There is a Redeemer Helmet modifier. Skills supported by Unleash have +1 maximum number of seals. And then if we use Awakened Unleash, we're getting another seal. So you can actually get up to 9 seals, which means that when you push that Blade Vortex, you're instantly going up, well, not instantly, but almost instantly going up to 10 charges, and then getting a big fat chunk of more damage from the Primal Owl. But let's speak about the most important thing before we get too excited. And that is to do with poison proliferation on this version of the build. So traditionally, with most poison builds, a lot of people are going to be using things like Obliteration or something like Ascendancy's Gentle Touch. This means that enemies you kill have a chance to explode, and those explosions can poison the enemy, which means that you're getting this like pseudo poison proliferation throughout the pack of monsters. Another thing very popular on Pathfinder is when you kill a poison enemy during any flask effect, nearby enemies are poisoned. This creates poison proliferation. But on Assassin, we have a major problem, and that is to do with proliferation. So if we are using Obliteration, which then causes those enemies to explode, which then poisons nearby enemies, the problem is explosions have a base crit chance of 0%. So remember how I said any increases, like increased critical strike chance, will increase that base number? That means that unless we're able to get generic base crit somewhere, our explosions cannot crit. And because of this line on Perfect Agony, non-crits cannot inflict ailments. That means our explosions cannot poison. So the biggest problem with this version of the build, and I've discussed this here, is that our explodes cannot poison, meaning that the build doesn't have as good clear as you generally would expect from a Blade Vortex build. There is not really any easy way to solve this early on. Getting base crit is not possible, at least on this version of the build, unless there's something I'm missing. Maybe there's something on the new grafts where we're getting base crit, but it's very unlikely. One way we can get it though is with a weapon swap and a Benos. On killing a poison enemy, nearby enemies are poisoned. But the problem is Benos is a tier 0 unique. This is as rare as a Mage Blood. There is no shot you're getting this early on in League. People might be putting them up before a premium. If people are using them, they're extremely rare. And if they're not using them or selling them, they might be just chucking them over to ROG for disenchantment to get a whole lot of dust. So Benos is the only real solution for getting poison prolif on this build, and it's nothing that we can get early on. So early, I tested it. It feels better than expected. I thought it would feel terrible, but when you test it with Benos, you immediately feel the difference of like, man, these poisons are not proliferating, so it doesn't feel as good. For that reason, I don't even know if Obliteration is that worth using. It does have a decent base crit of 8.7 this league, but it might be worth just using something like this instead to get that higher base crit. But I mean, the explosions do something. It's just that they're not able to poison, so it really does not feel as good. So for people playing poison assassin builds with Perfect Agony, be aware of this. If you're using things like Ascendancy or Obliteration, those explosions are not critting, and therefore they are not dealing poisons. So let's go over the leveling trees and all the various setups that I have here. So earliest BV swap, I would say, is around level 70. Because of Perfect Agony, we really want to make sure that we have our crit chance decently high. That's why I suggest using an Ezomite Dagger, which is getting a base crit buff, even with a +1 and a benched increased critical strike chance. That's giving us 10% base crit, which is very high, combined with our power charges and some stuff on the tree. At level 70, like just entering maps, I would say that is like the earliest that you can put on BV. BV, if you use it prematurely, feels terrible. It feels so unbelievably bad. So for that reason, I'm exploring different options for leveling. I'm not going to do the usual hand holding leveling that I always have done in the past, where I like have a spreadsheet and say, take this, take this. Instead, what I'll do is explore options and then link a PoB for leveling to at least get to this point where you're level 70. It's probably going to be something like Rain of Arrows, maybe even Poisonous Concoction, even though it was nerfed. Could also do something like EK, or I'll figure it out and I'll link it at a later stage. But very importantly is to not swap to BV until you have met these requirements. You want to have a Dendrobate, which is a tier 5 unique. It's very common, but you want to have 300 dexterity and 150 intelligence. That's because Dendrobate has this line. It deals, I think, 80 to 100% increased damage with poison while you have at least 300 dex, and 15 to 25% increased poison duration while you have 150 intelligence. So that is giving us increased damage with poison, and then also increased total poison damage, also giving us level 10 chance of poison, which is giving us 40% increased chance of poison on our Blade Vortex, and then a nice chunk of evasion rating, energy shield, and resistances. So this is the first thing you must have. Next, Ungol's Harmony, preferably with the exceptional performance annoyance. So Ungol's Harmony grants a massive amount of global critical strike chance. This is also a tier 5 unique, so very, very common. Gives us 250 to 350 increased global critical strike chance, helping us to push up that crit number combined with our dagger very, very high, very early. As for the annoyance exceptional performance is super nice because not only is it very cheap, clear, amber, black, it grants us 25% increased skill effect duration, which means that our Blade Vortex lasts for longer and we don't have to push that button as often. So even on a budget version of this build, your Blade Vortex is lasting for 7 seconds, so you only have to push that button once every 7 seconds or so. The other thing you really need to have is that Rune Dagger, like I spoke about, preferably with +1 level of all physical spell skill gems, and then benched or normal increased critical strike chance. Not increased critical strike chance for spells, but increased critical strike chance. You can bench that on, or I suppose what you could get would be something like this with crit chance for spells. This would, early on, this would be super, super nice. This should get you crit cap very easily. Something like this is ideal. Next thing is you have to do your first 3 labs, like no question. And the next thing is Vile Blade Vortex. Vile Blade Vortex is very strong for bosses. It allows us to hit the bosses more, apply more poison, deal more damage. So it should be a priority to get a Vile Blade Vortex, and then also to try and get a 20% quality Vile Blade Vortex. The thing with Vile Blade Vortex, quality actually increases the hit rate, so it'll hit more often, which means that it is doing more damage and applying more poisons. So without quality, this thing has a hit rate, it's hitting 7.5 times a second. With quality, it's 8.3. So it's actually a significantly higher amount of total poison damage. Again, it's not increasing our poison DPS, but it is increasing how many poisons we apply, which means our total damage is higher. So this is really, really good. The next thing we want to get is Leper's Arms. Leper's Arms has a big chunk of evasion rating, energy shields, decent chance to block, bit of life, and then 40% increased duration of ailments on enemies, increasing our total poison damage. And then Shared Suffering, which functions like a pseudo purity of elements, ailment avoidance. So Shared Suffering, the way this works is that all damage from hits will cause elemental ailments you're suffering. So if you're frozen and your Blade Vortex is up and then it hits an enemy, it'll transfer, well, it doesn't transfer to the enemy, but it'll inflict that freeze to the enemy. And then elemental ailments you inflict are removed from you. So this is like a pseudo elemental ailment avoidance early. Very, very nice. And also gives us a little bit of suppression. This, I think, is a tier 4 unique, so it's not as common as something like a Dendrobate, but it's usually not that hard to get. Might be a little bit expensive first couple of days, but then it drops rapidly. Ming's Heart, also very nice for gain % of physical damage as extra chaos. Again, this might be a little bit pricey if a lot of people are using it, but it drops very quickly and it provides huge damage at the expense of max life and max ES. Grants us a ton of chaos res as well, which is very, very nice. As for Obliteration, I don't even know if this is super worth using, like I spoke about with the Proliferations. It does feel okay though, so I still might give it a try. It's very, very common early on, but it might just be better to use a rare dagger or wand. Rest of the gear is going to be fairly straightforward, especially on the budget version. Main things we're looking out for is getting that dexterity to 300 for our Dendrobate, and then intelligence, resistances, spell suppression, and life, and a bit of strength is also really, really nice if you can get it on your Stygian Vise. Strength, life, resistances. As for our flask, non-negotiable is a quartz flask. For phasing on Blade Vortex, you don't want to be bumping into monsters constantly, so you can use phasing flask, quartz flask, or you could even go with this mastery down here, chance to, you gain phasing if you've suppressed spell damage recently. Jade flask, Quicksilver for moving more quickly, Divine for life recovery. At Ziri's Promise, bit of extra damage, and Leech, which I will speak about. I guess I can speak about it right now. So with recovery in maps, our recovery in maps is great. Because of Toxic Delivery, we're recovering life per poison affecting enemies we kill. Then the other thing is over here, we're getting 2% of energy shield on kill from Soul Thief and 2% of mana on kill. those are all conditional on kill effects. So for bosses, those are not going to be applying. However, what we can use is stuff like at series promise, 2% of chaos damage leached as life during effect. And then up here on the tree, we can get 1 point of energy shield leech for a bit of energy shield leech. And then also on our gloves, we can get another 0.3% of chaos damage leached as life. Now, very important is that damage over time cannot be leached from. So the poisons we're inflicting, we're not leeching from that. We can only leech from the actual hit from our Blade Vortex. So very commonly, what people like to use on Blade Vortex, or most poison builds, is Deadly Ailments. Deal 44% more damage with ailments, but 80% less damage with hits. If we were, let's just turn off Cruelty, you can see our leech on hit rate is about 340 for our life and 200 for our ES. If we turn this on, that plummets down to 50 and 57. So it's like 7 times lower because this thing is massively reducing our hit DPS and we can't leech from the damage over time. So for that reason, I recommend instead of using Deadly Ailments, instead use Cruelty or Void Manipulation, especially on bosses. Then with that series promise, we're getting even more leech, even more life leech. So this is like some life recovery for bosses. Of course, we also have our life flask. You could maybe get some life regeneration here and there on the tree, but I think this is very important to point out. Deadly Ailments is going to break any life leech that you do get on your build. As for skills, we've got our BV, very important, Blade Vortex. You can throw out these additional vortexes that hit the enemy and then unleash critical damage. This is going to increase our damage over time multiplier for our poisons, efficacy, more damage over time, and also increase skill effect duration, meaning our Blade Vortex lasts longer. And then Unbound Ailments. Unbound Ailments is the final link because it's really just mostly useful against bosses for getting that total poison damage up, but you're not going to really feel this as much in maps. It does still have 19% more damage with ailments, but if I disable this, you see the damage is like 4.3 million. If I turn it on, it's 6.4. But again, look at the single poison DPS. It's 150 with it and 129 without it. So if you were to use like Void Manipulation while mapping, you're actually getting higher DPS, but your total damage is lower. Curses, early on just use Despair, just self-cast Despair. Later on, for Pinnacle bosses and probably Pinnacle bosses alone, we can use a Temp Chains linked with Arcanist Brand. Temp Chains is really good for poisons because other effects on cursed enemies expire 25% slower. So that includes our poisons. So if we go to the bossing setup, in order to use those 2 curses, you'll need Whispers of Doom. So you have to like unspec a bit of stuff or you can anoint it. But this really quite significantly increases our total poison damage. If I turn that off, you see it goes down to 7.8. With it on, total damage is higher. And that's just because our poison duration here is 8.47 with it on. With it off, it is 6.27. So our poisons are lasting longer and dealing more damage over that period of time. But for just general mapping, just Despair on bosses. Later on, if you want, you can use Astronauts Corrupted with Despair for like auto cursing. Next are our auras, Malevolence for more damage over time and increased skill effect duration. And then Grace, Herald of Agony grants us increased chance of poison and more damage with poison. And then later on, we can throw in a Herald of Purity as well because it's giving us more physical damage. It's also going to summon some little dudes that, I don't know, maybe they will do something useful. Now, another very important thing to talk about with any poison build is Wither application. So Wither is a debuff that can stack up to 15 times, and each stack will make the monster 6% increased chaos damage taken. So with 15 stacks, this is a lot of damage. So making sure you have a decent amount of Wither is really important. However, early on, this isn't super easy to do. You can use like a Wither or a Spell Totem, Wither linked with Spell Totem, or a Withering Step that will apply 6 Withered stacks the first time an enemy enters the area. With quality, that'll be 8. That's why in the config, the Withered stacks set to 8 and not 15 like that, because in practice, you're probably only going to be getting 8 early on. There are ways to automate this later on. This is why, again, Pathfinder is generally preferable for poison builds because this is applying Wither much more frequently and it's got increased effective Wither, and also Occultist is also very nice for Wither. This build, our Wither application is kind of bad. So you can use either Withering Step or I would probably say on bosses, Wither with Spell Totem just make sure this thing is staying alive and applying those Wither sacks. Later on though, I've spoken about Wither here. We can get Wither from Unholy Might. That has a couple of sources. Since Rebirth Flask, which is a tier 1 unique, so it's very rare early. You can also get Corruption on Obliteration, which is gain Unholy Might on kill. Not particularly useful on bosses, which is where you really, really need it. Later on, you can get a Balance of Terror with, if you've cast Despair in the last 10 seconds, apply Wither on hit. That's really good, but early on, our Wither application is not amazing. Then Shield Charge, faster attacks, Frostbank, can use Flame Dash if you prefer. For Endurance Charge generation, another problem we have is how do we do it? And that is currently, I'm looking at Enduring Cry with Urgent Orders, which is like, it's the grossest way to get endurance charges. But if you're desperate, it's probably going to be the only way early. Another thing you can do that I've done in the past, at least for mapping, that's really nice, is an Overcharged Anoint instead of Exceptional Performance. This grants you 8% chance to gain a Power Frenzy or Endurance Charge and kill. Very, very good for mapping, especially if you have like the 3% increased damage per Endurance Frenzy or Power Charge, or the increased duration. This can be really good. And if you pair that with Immortal Call, this is actually very, very nice for juice mapping. Can maybe go with like an Enduring Composure, Small Cluster, or another thing you could do is later on maybe using like an Accumulator Wand, something like this, gain 2 charges every 6 seconds. Combine that with 100% increased charge duration. You should be at max charges always. But early on, if you got another suggestion, let me know. But this is the best I could come up with. It's not necessarily necessary. It's not turned on in the config, so that's not inflating any numbers, but it is there. Next thing, Plague Bearer. Plague Bearer, it gains an incubating buff as you deal poisons, and then once you decide to release it, it basically creates like a poison righteous fire around you. Righteous poison. Very nice early on. This thing will massively help your clear early on. So Plague Bearer, always very good. Then Blood Rage if you want frenzies early, but this thing, it might feel really bad, the degen. With mapping, it should be fine though, because we've got really good recovery from our Ascendancy. And then Steel Skin, you could put this on a cast when damage taken, or just manual cast. I would probably put cast when damage taken on this, or you could even use Immortal Call if you are using Overcharge. I need to figure out how to level this. Definitely do not want to swap into BV too early. So I will make some suggestions and link it in the description when I get a chance. But this build, it surprised me. It really, really surprised me. Again, I'm not 100% sure I'm going to be starting it, but if I do, I will let you know. Also, what you can do is join the Discord, because I'm sure there will be people who do play this. I'll make a channel where you guys can discuss the build, talk to each other, make some suggestions. If I'm playing it, of course, I'll be able to talk to you about the adjustments, but I'm not 100% sure I'm going to be playing BB this league, but I know a lot of people did want to play it. And like I said, it surprised me how well it performed, even on like a terrible version. You can see this is like the budget version. We got about 150k poison, 6.4 million total poison. This was a test one I did, and just actually like a third of the damage. So the fact that this on a third of the damage could take down Maven and do like tier 16s and tier 16.5s leads me to believe that this could actually be a really, really underrated and strong build, especially if you go into the config and click all the stuff that makes the numbers go up. Like, wow, this thing does 15 million damage. That's so cool. But I'll leave it to the ethical setup for now. Anyway, that's going to be it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, join the Discord, follow me on Twitch. I'll let you know when I'm going to play this league. I'll figure out how to level this thing. That's it.